Hey folks, thanks for watching. It's Thursday, October 23rd. I was looking at this view this morning. This is the earth.nullschool.net. If you've not been here, it's a great website to go and look at all different things. You can look at like ocean currents and waves. Eric and I have been looking at this site for like 3-4 years, maybe more. And we just found out that there's these projection options at the bottom. So you can like change which projection the globe is in, which some of these are kind of silly, admittedly, but like, I don't know, this one's kind of neat, the global flat view. Not sure which projection that is. Oh, I think it showed up there. Equirectangular. I've never heard that before. But that kind of gives you a neat view of the jet stream across the whole globe, so you don't have to like pan around the actual globe, but it is fun to do that as well. But the reason I pulled this up was to talk about this Pacific jet extension. I actually went back and looked it up, and we were talking about this back on October 9th, so exactly 2 weeks ago. And it's not to say, we were able to put a specific forecast together, but we saw the potential for this mountain torque event that could then extend the Pacific jet, if you will, and that's come to fruition in the forecast. There's good model agreement in that, allowed us to kind of up our confidence in that, and seeing that now making its way all the way across and begin to impact British Columbia with some heavy rains and high winds. We'll look at that in just a second here. You can also see this deep trough across the eastern U.S., kind of centered over the Great Lakes. That's brought some colder weather in to the central and the eastern U.S. here of late, and those showers that we talked about yesterday through New England. And then not showing up much here, but Tropical Storm Melissa is going to start showing up on this map more and more, would be my guess, as it starts to impact the jet stream above it over the next few days while it strengthens. I'll talk about Melissa kind of near the end of this video. Another way we can view this Pacific jet stream, let's just look at the satellite. This is the infrared satellite across the eastern Pacific here this morning. North America is on our right, and this is an awesome view. You can see those high-level wispy cirrus clouds flowing very quickly along that very fast Pacific jet extension coming right into British Columbia like we saw. And then this divide between these two air masses, the one to the north of the jet stream. This is how the jet stream works, by the way. It divides the two air masses that we have, the subtropical warmer air mass south across California to Hawaii, all the way over here toward Midway. And then to the north, you notice these like little speckled clouds. This is what we call open cell convection, and indicative of some cold air advection, some colder air here. Warmer air to the south, the jet stream is going to flow quickly in between that. That's really all it comes down to. Essentially with the jet stream, you can think of it as like a thermal wind flowing between the warm air here and the cold air toward the poles. What that means for the west is, frankly, rain and some gusty winds. So if we just look at the forecast for the European model over the next few days, already seeing that impact up here along British Columbia, snow along the coastal ranges there. But as I take this forecast out, let's go into early tomorrow morning. Rain begins across the Seattle-Tacoma area, the Olympic Mountains, northwest Oregon. This is 11 a.m. So we get into the evening, spreading across the Willamette Valley. Some of this going all the way over to Spokane, portions of central Washington, and to northern California, Friday evening. By Saturday, the low proper, just offshore west of Washington, Vancouver. And this is much stronger precipitation at this point in the Willamette Valley, even getting snow up into the Cascades at this point, some rainfall, potentially all the way as far south as San Francisco, into the Sacramento Valley. This is now Saturday morning. Some of that pushing out, getting some rain and snow in the higher elevations of Idaho. Not seeing as much get across into Canada, just given the trajectory of the system, kind of out of the due west. But even another little low coming in now, early Sunday morning, impacting Northern California, with lingering showers, snow in the upper elevations here, all the way into Sunday evening, maybe even getting some snow down into the Snake River area by Sunday evening. By Monday morning, a little bit of a lull and break early next week, but boy, we have another low bending up into the Seattle-Tacoma area. That's like Tuesday into Wednesday overnight, and that one looks potent as well, albeit a little bit further north across the region. And then not really going calmer until way later in the forecast, but really this area staying in line. And we'll look at this in the long range. I think there's quite a bit of support that this corridor specifically, maybe like, might be excluding the Willamette Valley. We'll look at that when we get to the end of kind of the slides here today. But definitely a lot of activity for the northwest U.S. And then if you kept your eye over here, you saw some lows sneaking through there. We'll talk about those in just a second. I wanted to focus on the west first. Anywhere from Portland down to like Salem, looking at 2+ inches of rain. We could exceed that in some locations. So you see a few of those values getting up near 3, maybe even 4 inches. I don't know if we'll get that high. But certainly quite a bit of rain coming for Seattle, Tacoma, down through Portland, and all the way through Corvallis, through the upper Willamette Valley. Even looking at like 1.25 inches in Spokane, central Washington, getting quite a bit of rainfall relative to how much they receive in a year. And all the way over to the Snake River Valley, western Montana, seeing a bit of rain as well. My eye is already caught by the heavier rainfall amounts for East Texas, western Louisiana over the next few days that desperately need some rainfall after the deficits that they have accrued here recently. I was a little bit surprised to see the wind potential of this storm is, of course, higher up near British Columbia coast, where the Pacific Jet Extension is making its way on shore, so the stronger low pressure system there. Not seeing a strong wind move into the Pacific Northwest right now. You can see some stronger, 40 to 50 mile an hour gusts at higher elevations here, but Willamette Valley is still pretty light. California not seeing a strong wind, so maybe not as big of a wind event for the west, unless you're right along the coast here between Washington and Oregon. Some gusty winds in the interior part of the country as these lows come through, but nothing, totally eye-catching at this point in the forecast. Kind of bigger story, I think, for the central U.S. right now, save for the rainfall that might be coming, is the temperatures. Talked about this yesterday. Those temperatures falling. Yesterday was kind of more so over in the Missouri River, and that has started to spread east, even getting freezing values as far east as the Indiana-Illinois border. So we have kind of a wide area of freezing temperatures at this point, and this is going to be shifting east into tomorrow, into Friday morning. If we look at the all hazards map, this is the freeze warnings are in that indigo color. The frost advisories are in the lighter blue. See those freeze warnings extending all the way from Wisconsin into the Appalachians at this point, through portions of Kentucky, the southwestern, almost half of Ohio, if you will, for temperatures getting all the way down below freezing, so below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost advisories in blue, temperatures not quite as cold as you get closer to these areas here. Definitely cold air on the way. I'll say this is kind of cut in half, so areas east of here is more so for Friday, whereas west, we're already seeing those freezing temperatures here this morning. We can see that just with the morning forecast did pretty well, forecasting that down to freezing in a wide swath here. But if I take this forecast into tomorrow morning, that's the 24th, all the way down into 30 for central Indiana and Illinois, 30 in southwestern Ohio, 32 in Lexington, and then up in the upper elevations, even Virginia, getting down into the mid-30s. Seeing a wide area of frost and freeze tomorrow across the Ohio River Valley and the Corn Belt. Warming up on the backside with that Pacific Jet Extension coming through. We're going to have our low somewhere in this area, and that's going to start to drawing warm air back into this region. And that's why this cold is kind of exiting east in the forecast. I'll take this out a little bit further. Let's go into Saturday morning. Frost and freeze continuing to settle across the eastern Corn Belt now. Michigan, Ohio, central Indiana starting to warm up out of that freezing territory. Now New York, portions of Boston getting down to 35, 34, some frost there. And that continuing on Monday, but that warmth coming in behind it. So upper 20s, some of the valleys here of Pennsylvania, 30s in New York, getting maybe down to the 20s in portions of New England. And then in the Metro East, looking like low 40s at this point along the coast. And then, just for the heck of it, let's go all the way out. You can see that warmth spreading across the U.S. I wanted to pull up this map. This is the ECMWF on the right, the GFS on the left. We're comparing the two here, and I pull this up because I usually look at this and I will bring it up when there's some stark differences between the two, and they have much different opinions. But I was actually impressed by how similar the two were. That isn't always the case in the forecast, but it does sort of boost our confidence a bit in the rainfall and where this pattern is going when these two models agree. And if I start taking this forecast out, let's do Friday morning at 7 a.m. There's decent agreement with this West Coast system as far as where's the rain, where's the snow, and the timing. Maybe the ECMWF is a little bit quicker with that progressive bias. And then, similar areas of rainfall over Kansas and Oklahoma. Still not seeing any major differences. Again, with this West Coast storm, the ECMWF maybe a touch quicker on the rainfall. But by and large, fairly similar between the two. If we go into Saturday afternoon, now the rainfall spreading across eastern Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri. We're starting to see a little bit of a difference. It's really the only one I spotted, majorly, is the ECMWF bringing some of this rainfall further north this weekend on Saturday and Sunday up north of the Ohio River. Whereas the GFS keeping the system a little bit further south. But, still pretty similar forecast here. Maybe some more rainfall getting east of the Cascades. But, by and large, a fairly similar forecast between the two. I'm going to take this a little bit further out. Here comes that little secondary low coming into Northern California. Decent agreement between the two on that one. Our low down in the southern Mississippi Valley now. That rainfall spreading a little bit east on Sunday. Again, the ECMWF just maybe... Oh, you know what? I had it backwards when I was looking at this earlier. It was the GFS that was pulling rainfall a little bit further north, not the ECMWF, excuse me. But still, impressive similarities between the two, even out now. We're at 102 hours for multiple lows here. And then the ECMWF, again, a little bit quicker, that progressive bias pushing us off the coast just a touch quicker. Some of that rainfall lingering in the GFS, but here comes that low behind it. The rainfall across the upper Midwest, the northern plains, similar there. Lingering showers across the northwest. You can see that between the two models. This low lapping up a little bit slower. Again, the ECMWF just quicker overall with these systems as they come through, but still, we're all the way out 144 hours out, and there may be differing by 6 hours on the timing here. So I still think that's impressive agreement. And then that central and eastern Corn Belt, lingering showers and precip on Tuesday and Wednesday. So another shot of rainfall expected through this corridor here for those that miss it on Sunday. And then again, the GFS just lingering this low a little bit longer. Now the ECMWF, this is where we start getting into a proper difference between the two. We're all the way a week out at this point. That is more than to be expected at this point. But a decent coastal low now developing 980 millibars, one of these nor'easter type lows, developing from the ECMWF, and the GFS also developing just a little bit later. Again, just a little bit slower in the forecast. And this would bring some impressive winds over to New England that we'll have to talk about. We'll look at that in a second. And then decent, 980, 990 millibar low from the ECMWF. GFS bringing a little bit slower, so more rainfall into New England, but the ECMWF still spinning here as well. And then at this point, we're way out into the forecast, and the ECMWF does have its own low pressure system at this point. But I do want to talk about those winds because we focused on the West Coast earlier. Now, this is the GFS model. If you remember, this one was a little bit slower, so this hugged the coastline a little bit more. You'll see Wednesday, we quickly developed that coastal low. By Thursday, strong winds moving into New England, like Rhode Island, on Boston, up into Maine along the coast, gusts up to 50 to 60 miles an hour. Strong rain and wind before moving to the east later in the week here. So potentially another one of these nor'easters. This would give us kind of second coastal low already here at the end of October, early November. I do want to touch on Halloween because we did get all the way out to the Halloween. Let's actually get to trick-or-treating time, 7 p.m. Friday. Fortunately, maybe for folks in New England, the worst of that coastal low will be exiting at this point, save for areas in Maine, up in maritime Canada. Look over the central U.S. There's a big disagreement here between the two, whether we'll have rain across the upper Midwest and the central Corn Belt or not, between the GFS and the ECMWF. I'm going to ignore that for a second because those details will become more clear a little bit later. I think the bigger story might be temperatures because we're forecasting a pretty chilly Halloween, or at least Halloween weekend at this point. So I'm going to take this forecast out from the ECMWF showing those temperatures. We'll go slowly initially. So we kind of already covered these. The warmth coming up with these low pressure systems coming in. So you can see 1 p.m. Sunday, getting up into the 50s, 60s across a wide portion of the interior, all the way up into the 80s along the Gulf Coast. Taking this out to next week, still in the 50s. For a wide portion of the central U.S., but by Thursday, as that coastal low spins up, you can actually see it here in the temperatures. Now we're cooling off quickly in the eastern U.S. down to the 30s and 40s by 1 a.m. Thursday morning, down into 30s and 40s across the central U.S., and look at even 50s all the way down to the Gulf Coast. And that increased by 7 a.m. Thursday morning, look down into the 50s, almost 48 here near Pensacola. So much colder along the Gulf Coast. This is Thursday morning. Now, Friday morning, potential freeze again in the central or eastern Corn Belt. We'll have to see exactly how that low spins up because that could muddy that forecast a bit. But if you do 7 p.m. Friday, 40s across a wide portion of the country for trick-or-treating, 40s, if not upper 30s across New England, even 40s, or low 50s in the Carolinas, 50s down through portions of the southeast. So not an ice cold, not like you need to wear your parka for trick-or-treating, but definitely on the chillier side, especially folks in here who are probably going to think that, low 50s and high 40s are pretty cool. We can see this, I think a little bit more simply just with the 5-day temperature departures. So in the lead up to that Pacific jet extension, we often see increased warmth across Canada. So that's the case with these next 5 days worth of temperature anomalies, cooler on the backside of that trough that I showed you all the way at the beginning of this video. As I take this out, 5 to 10 days with that coastal low spinning up, that low sneaking through the southern U.S. and the cold air coming in behind it, much cooler, and that kind of Halloween corridor for the southeast. Going to feel like a chilly trick-or-treat there, whereas areas here, it's just going to be a little bit colder than normal, and then still seeing that warmth in Canada. If I take the forecast further, starting to see heat build across the southwest, cooler across the east. Keep an eye on this temperature pattern. So I'm going to be talking about this a little bit later as we get into the early November forecast. If we just sum this all up with the 10-day precip anomalies from the ECMWF, upper Midwest, we see kind of 3/4 of precipitation along that coastal low. and then through the southern U.S., the southern plains getting those needed rains, the Pacific Northwest, just the onslaught of precipitation and the snowfall in the upper elevations here for the Cascades and portions of the British Columbia coastal ranges there. Now, I did want to touch on the MJO. Eric and I will often, mention the MJO in summer, but you'll notice that if you watch these videos in like August, September, or like June, certainly not July, but some of those kind of transitional months that we are struggling to figure out if the MJO is playing a bigger role in the atmosphere, there can be these other low frequency events that are playing a bigger role. I mentioned yesterday that East Asian mountain torque was probably the more responsible influence for that Pacific jet extension. And in fact, the MJO, when we see those mountain torques, predictably makes this big swing out of the Indian Ocean into the maritime continent. And it's almost, it's a cart horse thing where it's not necessarily the MJO that's driving the pattern in that case, but maybe even the mountain torque that's pulling the MJO around. But at this point, decent agreement now that the MJO is coming over into phase 5 and then 6 in the early part of November, at least late October. You can see this forecast kind of taking it a little bit closer to null space. Some of these keeping them over here. But I'm definitely seeing this transition from phase 5, 6 into 7, and decent agreement on that in the models. Now, I always want to look out in the forecast and see if I can confirm this MJO activity with what's actually going on over in the Western Pacific or the maritime continent. And one way to do that is MJO activity, at least in fall, is often associated with tropical cyclones. And so if the MJO is moving from here to here, we're likely going to see tropical cyclones in the forecast. And sure enough, there's these areas of investigation, tropical depression, 97 west here near the Philippines. And so that does line up pretty decently with that forecast. Another way we can look at this is looking for ascent in the upper levels of the atmosphere. What I mean by that is air rising, so not moving north, but rising up. And then air sinking outside of that region is also indicative of proper MJO activity. And when we look at the Hofmuller diagram, which shows us just that, here's the present day on October 23rd. This takes us into the forecast. And we can see a lot of rising motion here currently over the Indian Ocean, over the maritime continent, where we saw those potential tropical cyclones. So that lines up. And then over the next few days, that is in fact moving over phase 5 and phase 6, and maybe kind of hugging that, 5 to 6, not necessarily getting all the way onto phase 7, but kind of staying in that line. So seeing agreement from 3 different things here that MJO activity, is real, if you will. So always trying to piece together, what might be one of these Kelvin waves, which quickly races across and maybe doesn't have quite the same level of influence. So given that agreement, can this tell us something about where we're headed in early November? And if we just look to history as a guide, as we often do, I'm going to take us phase 5 into early November, that first week. And we get a pretty decent dichotomy. Cold across the eastern U.S., warming up across the northwest, at least the western U.S. What about phase 6? Because remember, we saw it kind of getting stuck into phase 6. Well, that cold may be inching a little bit further east into the U.S., and that warmth staying here in the western U.S. And now we're starting to get some flow over the top, diving down like this. And that's kind of similar to the La Nina forecast that we had for winter to begin with, if you remember that. And that makes sense because in La Nina winters, we often see a lot of MJO activity over here, over in the West Pacific or the maritime continent, phase 6. Take it all the way into phase 7. If we go let's get to the middle of November, see that cold kind of leaving, and then that heat more so still stuck across the western U.S. Now, curiously, starting to get a Hudson trough here. So maybe by the end of or the middle part of November, we start to maybe see that positive TNH pattern that I talked about a little bit earlier. I'm gonna wait to dive more into that because now I'm almost a month out in the forecast, and I don't want to put too much significance on where we're going here. But certainly, there is support for this general cooler east, warmer west pattern, with maybe better flow into the Pacific Northwest and better rain chances for the eastern U.S. And so with that kind of higher confidence of the forecast, we'll go over and look at the 8 to 14 day outlook from the Climate Prediction Center. Generally warm, cool, not necessarily cool for Maine, but warm across the west, cooler across the eastern U.S. So that sort of forecast playing out, wetter across New England, drier across the interior, wetter with better flow across Northwest. That makes sense with that flow coming in like this. Better support for lows here, better support for these little lows here coming on shore, and a big high, and dominating lack of precip in the interior of the country. So decent alignment from a lot of these forecasts. I'm just taking the ECM to BF ensemble forecast all the way out to November 4th at this point. And there's that better flow here into the Northwest. There's that troughing in the east. And these long-range forecasts aren't always what I'll say this easy or this kind of telegraphed, but this one, there seems to be decent support over in the Pacific, decent support here in the models, and then we have our meteorologist from the Climate Prediction Center also seeing this. And so this meteorologist recording this video sees enough confidence to feel pretty confident about where we're going in early November, maybe the 1st through the 6th, 1st through the 7th. Start to get out in the middle part of November, and I think there's some questions about whether that TNH pattern comes on or not. You can also see this just in the 8 to 14 day precip panel that we have here. I'll see if I can make this a little bit bigger. And lost my slider, so that went too much. Okay. Talked about the CPC, but similarities from the ECMWF ensemble: wetter in New England, drier across the interior, wetter across the Northwest, wetter across the East in the AIFS. A few differences here across the Southeast. But this is an operational model, so we'd expect some more granularity. And then the GFS ensemble, maybe the driest of the 4 here, with a wide area of a below average precip with maybe some lows sneaking through the upper Midwest, northern plains, before wrapping up into the east. I did want to touch on Melissa. I mentioned at the beginning of this video. I'm going to get into those slides now. I will say the biggest update as of yesterday is a lot of the models and consensus had the storm with the potential to develop into a very strong hurricane. In fact, some of the models take it freakishly strong. I'm not going to show some of those because there's still uncertainty there. But now the official forecast from the National Hurricane Center is up to a Category 4 strength storm as we get out into this weekend. It's still expecting to make this slow push toward the north before moving west, south of Jamaica. And, I'm a little bit worried about that island. I should say a lot of it worried because of how slow the storm is moving and how strong it's getting. So you're talking about prolonged conditions near a major hurricane, which is going to be a significant issue for Jamaica. Obviously, you could talk about wind, but if you just look at rainfall, the values are pretty extreme for that island here. You're getting off the color bar, which is 2 feet of rainfall, now forecast by November 1st for portions of eastern Cuba and Jamaica, if the model is correct and the storm makes the turn as expected. Also see very high rainfall in Haiti. Along the southern coast would be a significant issue. And again, we don't want big hurricanes forming here because they don't really have an outlet without affecting land and people. And that's the case certainly with Melissa. Now, Melissa developing slowly here today, that's been the expectation with some shear over it right now. There's actually, if you look closely, do you see the high clouds here moving this way? These little storms here across the Gulf. And then there's high clouds here moving that way. And so there's a little trough here, and that's giving just enough shear across Melissa to delay development, but it's still meandering to the north and west here, maybe the center somewhere under this convective plume. You can tell just by looking, there's no obvious circulation. It's just a lot of tropical thunderstorms, which is very similar to what it looked like yesterday. So it's very slow development. And you can almost tell too, whenever I see tropical storm with multiple large convective blowups, like in a larger area, that actually resists organization because you're trying to develop a little low here, you're trying to develop a low here, you're trying to develop a little low here. So you're not consolidating one area of central low pressure, which is how we define these storms more properly. So while this is occurring, expecting slower development over the next maybe 48 hours from Melissa, but as that shear wanes, expecting it to organize very quickly this weekend into a major hurricane. And if we look at some of these ensembles for the exact track of the storm, which will be critical both to Jamaica, Cuba, and these other land masses, a lot of these models jogging at west before recurving it north near the west side of Jamaica or into eastern Cuba. The GFS almost totally, for lack of a better word, on an island, no pun intended, all the way on the eastern envelope of these tracks, taking it right over Hispaniola. Can't rule that out, but not seeing that right now in any other model run. And then critically, I'm taking this all the way out to like late next week. Here's Halloween. No model runs have gotten into the Gulf now late next week. Some of these take it as a landfall over here in Central America. Some of it take it more so west over central Cuba, some a little bit further east between the two. But by and large, most models taking it at this point out of the Greater Antilles across Bahama and then into the Western Atlantic, and then still only seeing a few bend back toward North America, actually less than we saw yesterday. If I really get picky, I can find 1, 2, maybe 3 of all the 100 ensemble members that are bending that way. So the chance that this does make eventual landfall over in New England as maybe an extratropical storm, as a transitioning storm a la Sandy, is very low at this point. I can't rule it out. There's still a few members kind of sneaking that way late next week or the weekend, but it's not a material threat that I'm going to mention right now. I think that's my last slide for today. If you've been to the end of the video today, thank you for watching. And tomorrow on the 24th, Eric will talk with you all.